What if the hardest battles in life that we fight are not fought with weapons, but with surrender? What if the real victory begins the moment that you and I stop running and choose to face what scares us most with faith and courage instead of fear and in spite of fear? What's up, everybody? I'm Tyson Putthoff, and this is scene 24 of the JesusX30 Challenge. We're following my 3-volume book project, Jesus, the Strategic Life and Mission of the Messiah and His Movement. All 3 volumes are out now. You can pick them up wherever you buy your books, online, in bookstores. The print book is available. The ebook is available. You can even check out the book for free through public library apps like Hoopla and Overdrive. Check them out. Follow along. It's going to give you a lot more depth and insight and information, historical, exegetical, textual, linguistic, than we can get into in these short episodes. Welcome. We're in scene 24. So in this scene, we're looking at Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, and John 18. And this takes us to the Garden of Gethsemane. We arrived there in the previous scene. This is the garden on the Mount of Olives where Jesus will face his final decisions. He's with his disciples. It's late. The mood and the aura is intense because Jesus knows what is about to happen. His disciples still don't get it. They won't until after. But Jesus knows what's about to happen. And we came in the previous scene from the Last Supper, the Passover Seder meal that Jesus had with his disciples. And they entered the Garden of Gethsemane and they were singing the Passover Hallel Psalms. They're looking across the Kidron Valley and they're looking at the magnificent Jewish temple, the Jerusalem temple. And they're watching the Passover celebrations and all of the people and all of the torches and the lights. And it's a beautiful sight. But Jesus knows that this is not just another Passover celebration. He knows something momentous is about to happen, something cosmic. And all of this takes place at a place called Gethsemane. Okay, Gethsemane actually means oil press. And that's basically what's happening to Jesus, the anointed one, right? The one anointed by God with oil, the Mashiach, the Messiah, the Christ. He's now being pressed in every way, in spirit, in emotion, in mind, physically, we're about to see. And he knows what's coming. He knows the betrayal is in motion. The arrest is in motion. He knows he's going to face some kind of trials. And he knows he's headed toward the cross. It's not a surprise to him. What's remarkable is instead of escaping, instead of allowing that fight or flight or freeze, adrenaline rush and surge of emotions and chemicals in his body cause him to leave and abandon everything he's worked so hard toward, he faces it head on. You know he's afraid. You know he's sad. You know he's heartbroken. He even in a few moments is going to plead with God, God, take this cup from me. I don't want to do this anymore. He's going to submit. He's going to say, but not my will, but yours be done. But he doesn't want to do this in a human sense. He knows the impact. He knows it has to be done, but that doesn't mean his emotions and his mental state are intact at this point. He's a mess. Jesus is a mess, but he deliberately continues to press forward and toward his fate. So in the garden, Jesus decides he's got to go pray. And this is something he does every key moment in Jesus's life. Jesus goes and engages in prayer. And he tells his disciples, hey, sit here while I go over to pray. And he takes with him Peter, James, and John, his inner 3, the same ones that saw him in his glory at the Transfiguration. And this time they're going to see a wholly other side of him. They're going to see Jesus in his anguish, at his most sorrowful and troubled, as Matthew describes it. Mark describes Jesus as being deeply distressed. And these words literally describe this crushing emotional pain, even shock. Jesus is a wreck. And I still, like, if I put myself into this scene and into this moment with the disciples, if I'm sitting there with the disciples, I'm wondering why he's such a mess. He's been describing some things that are happening, but a king going into battle doesn't look like Jesus looks at this moment. They don't understand the battle that Jesus is about to go into. And so they still have this idea that he's gonna call them to arms and they're gonna storm the city and march in and overthrow Rome and all of these followers that have been following them throughout the last 2 years of Jesus's public campaign are going to come to their aid, and it's going to be a military victory. So they I imagine can't understand why he's such a mess at this point. This is not the calm and steady and composed Jesus that they've been watching for the last 2 years. The Jesus that calmly stood up in the boat and submitted the sea, the forces of chaos, just a short time ago. This isn't the Jesus that stands up in front of flocks of high-powered, wealthy, belligerent leaders coming to insult him in front of the crowds, and who stands up and calmly puts them in their place. This isn't the Jesus they're seeing. Jesus in the garden is a mess, and his prayer reflects that. He prays out to God, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." And Luke even mentions that his sweat became like drops of blood, Luke 22:44. And there's been a lot of debate and talk about this. This is actually a medical phenomenon in which such intense stress can cause these tiny blood vessels to burst. And so Jesus is at such a level of stress that he's in the garden, and he's literally bleeding while he's sweating and weeping. And he's covered in dirt, his face on the ground. He's come undone. And the disciples are watching this, and they're listening to his prayer. And Jesus continues to pray, "Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me." But then he submits. He says, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." And that word cup recalls a prophetic image. The prophets would use the language of cup when they would describe divine judgment. So the cup of wrath in Isaiah and Jeremiah. And Jesus isn't asking to avoid the pain. He's acknowledging that this is a big deal. This is a divine act at this point. He's choosing to drink that cup of divine judgment. Jesus understands that everything that's happening at this moment is divinely organized, is a divine act. And so this cup that he's asking God to take away from him is a cup that he knows God is serving him to drink. And it's a cup of judgment. It's a cup of pain. It's a cup of suffering. And he doesn't want it, but he knows that it needs to happen. So he embraces it. He rises up to the challenge, and he moves forward. And this is the last true moment of freedom that Jesus has before his arrest. And so in all of this, the disciples fall asleep. They can't even stay awake. They're literally watching Jesus in a way they've never seen him, in an emotional state, in a physical state. They've never seen him in their last 2 years with him. And they fall asleep. And 3 times Jesus comes and asks them, watch and pray with me. Stay with me. I need you by my side. And 3 times they fall asleep. And that same pattern mirrors, Peter's threefold denial, and later on Peter's threefold restoration. Jesus is awake and in agony, and his closest friends are numb and exhausted. And it's one of, I think, the most human pictures in all of Scripture. Jesus is fully present in his pain and in his suffering. And he's surrounded by people who are observing it, but they still can't comprehend it. And so it doesn't impact them on the level that it should. They're not able to stay awake. And then all of a sudden, you can imagine this scene. You're up in the trees in the garden, and you look down, and snaking up from the valley is a band of soldiers carrying torches, and the sound of their armor and the footsteps on the gravel as they march up towards you. And that's when I think everyone starts to wake up. And Jesus, he's getting that adrenaline rush in his heart, that rush of fight or flight or freeze. And the disciples, they're ready to go. They're not armed though, like they probably should have been. And so this group of soldiers, the temple guards, the leaders, they arrive to the garden, and Jesus doesn't hide. He rises and he steps forward and he says, "Who are you looking for?" He engages them. And they answer, "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth." And he replies, and this is fascinating, John records it, "I am." Ego eimi in Greek. Your translation may say something like "I am he," but the actual Greek and Jesus' actual words in Aramaic would have been "I am." And this recalls the way God revealed himself to Moses at the burning bush in the Exodus. "I am." Jesus is literally declaring himself God of the cosmos at this moment. And this is fascinating. John says that the soldiers drew back and fell to the ground. Okay, so there was no fighting, no onslaught by the disciples, surprise attack and knocking these soldiers down. When Jesus declares the divine name out of his mouth, the soldiers draw back and fall to the ground. That had to be such a brilliant, fascinating moment. I want to watch this on replay when we get to heaven someday and just see how that scene looked. Because the very voice of God emanating from Jesus' mouth at that moment, as he identified himself with God of the cosmos, flattens an entire group of soldiers and leaders. And instead of running off, right, that could have been the moment where Jesus says, hey, let's all get out of here. We've knocked them down. Let's escape. That's not what he does. He says, if you're looking for me, let everybody else go. And this is, I think, interesting. Even in his arrest, he continues to protect his followers, even after they've abandoned him for however long, for hours in this garden while he's weeping and sweating blood and praying and crying out to God, and in a state of such obvious physical and emotional and spiritual distress. They've abandoned him. They've left him on his own. And even still, when the soldiers, they rise to their feet, Jesus says, hey, can you let them go? I think a true leader does that. I think you can tell the difference between a true leader and a false leader, a self-absorbed leader or a Christ-like leader based on whether or not they're willing to protect those under their care and be the first one out front to face the danger on their behalf. Jesus models all of that at this moment. And so Peter, once again, still doesn't get it. Always impulsive. He grabs the sword and he lashes out and he cuts off the servant's ear. Remember that part of the scene? If you encourage you again, go read this scene. So Peter still doesn't get it. Even after in Matthew 16, Jesus said, hey, this is not a violent thing. After Peter identifies Jesus as the Messiah and Son of God. And Jesus said, this is all about suffering. And Peter says, I'll never let you suffer. All of these moments where Jesus is trying to convince Peter and all of the disciples around him and all of the masses of followers, this is not a violent messianic movement. Following me does not look like domination. It doesn't look like military power. It doesn't look like politicians waving the sword and saying, crying out in God's name, we're going to destroy our enemies. It's not that. Peter still thinks it's that. Jesus has tried to convince him that it's not that. And Jesus finally has to say, Peter, put the sword down, because all that's going to do is lead to death. All the sword will do is lead not only to your enemy's destruction, but it's going to lead to your own as well. And again, refer back to the prophetic words that Jesus gave not long ago, where Jesus actually described the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. That didn't happen because Rome attacked unprovoked. That happened because, as Jesus predicted, revolutionaries would try to rise up, fight Rome off, and Rome would squash them. Violence always leads to more violence, and eventually you're going to run into the bigger dog in the room and they're going to defeat you. Doesn't matter how big. And so Jesus stops Peter and he says, put your sword away. And he says, should I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? John 18:11. I think that's the defining line of the scene. Jesus isn't choosing weakness. Jesus could easily have started throwing punches at this point. He would have gotten beaten. He would have gotten arrested. All of what would happen still would have happened. He could have embodied this type of earthly or worldly strength that we think of, like tough guy strength. He could have done all of that. The fact that he didn't is not a moment of weakness. The fact that he didn't was a moment of purpose. He showed what he was all about. He showed who God really is at his core. And that is, this is a God and Jesus is a Jesus, and Jesus is Messiah-ing in a way that shows that it's not about domination. It's not about defeating your enemies. It's about serving them. It's about handing yourself over to them so that at the end, that will lead to their transformation, not their destruction. Refusing violence is not surrender to evil. It's surrender to God's greater plan. Okay? I want you to hear that. Refusing violence is not surrender to evil. It's surrender to God's greater plan. And Jesus demonstrates it right here in this moment. And the disciples scatter, just as Jesus predicted. Every one of them, they flee. The disciples run off. The Gospels don't sugarcoat this. They could have ignored this and retelling the story to kind of prop up the egos of the disciples, make the origins of this Jesus movement a little more glorious, but they don't. They say, hey, look, everyone who was a part of the initial moments of this Jesus movement that we're preaching about, everyone failed when it was at its most critical point. And Jesus had already said, you strike the shepherd, the sheep are going to scatter. So it happens. So Jesus is arrested. Jesus is bound by the soldiers and the temple guards and the leaders, and he's led back from the garden down into the Kidron Valley and toward the city. And this is a long walk. And this is interestingly the same valley where David 1,000 years earlier had fled in tears. And now this is Jesus's own path into the city. And Luke records him saying, this is your hour when darkness reigns. And it's a pretty chilling line, I would say, but it's also kind of a boundary if we want to theologize this. This darkness has an hour. The rest of eternity belongs to God. This is the decisive engagement, the battle that will truly be the culminating battle in this war that Jesus has waged against the forces of sin and death and against the empires of this world. But it's not fought with armies. It's fought with love. It's fought with self-sacrifice. We've got to understand Jesus is facing not just Rome or a religion. He's not starting a religious movement. He is going to battle against the cosmic forces of sin and death. And he does not defeat them by overpowering them, right? You can't go and defeat sin, and you can't go and defeat death with a sword. You go and defeat sin, and you go and defeat death by surrendering to them, submitting to them, allowing them to defeat you. And in allowing them to defeat you, as Jesus demonstrates, he overcomes them. He nullifies their power by taking their most vicious punch and rising again. And he stands there in place of humankind, allows them through their earthly proxies, the Roman authorities, violently defeat him. What we see, I think, in this Gethsemane moment is what spiritual maturity really looks like. It's honesty without despair and surrender without apathy and courage without control. Jesus, I think, makes it pretty clear that obedience can tremble, right? Faith can sweat. Faith in God is not a lack of doubt. It's not having a moment of emotional distress. When life gets ugly, we can ugly cry, and that's okay. And Jesus does in this moment where everything is compounding on him and his friends don't get it. His family has already rejected him because he's not Messiah-ing the way they wanted him to Messiah. And the world is on Jesus' shoulders, and he has moments of worry, moments of doubt, moments of anxiety. He is a mess. And I think he shows us that obedience, in spite of this, is okay. Having these moments is okay. And we can cut ourselves some slack, because when life gets tough, it's okay to be upset. But I think Jesus also shows us the way forward, that you can still embrace whatever you're going through, because that moment of suffering, that moment of defeat, that moment of failure will eventually lead to victory. You may not be in a literal garden like Jesus was, but you know the feeling of being pressed between what you want and what's right, between fear and faith. And it's in that pressure that the greatest transformation happens. And I think when we learn to reframe this discomfort, not as something that we're supposed to escape, but as something that if we embrace it and we grow through it, we'll come out better on the other side. If we start to reframe the way we approach these Gethsemane moments, each time a Gethsemane moment arises in our lives, we'll be a little bit better at handling it. Jesus modeled that, and I think his disciples hung on to that. And I imagine that once they started to suffer, once they started to go out and spread Jesus's movement to the ends of the earth, and they faced opposition, I think they probably remembered the moment in Gethsemane when Jesus faced the greatest pressure, the pressure of the cosmos on his shoulders, and he embraced it and he confronted it head on. Maybe this scene is an invitation when you feel crushed or anxious or alone. Remember that even Jesus fell to the ground under the weight, and he cried out to God in distress, but he stood again. He rose up and he embraced the situation and he rose to the moment. And the very same spirit that gave him strength at that moment is the same spirit that you and I have to carry us through our own moments. Lake Ulmad, go and learn. Come back for scene 25 of the Jesus X30 challenge.